Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
All right, it's my turn. And in keeping with this theme, for this round, I didn't search movie lists, but I remembered that one of the ones that I had been seeing on the list a couple times was The Curious Case of Benjamin Button by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And yeah, it was published in 1922, so it's old as shit. Benjamin nodded coldly. Pretty little thing, he said indifferently. But when the Negro boy had led the buggy away, he added, Dad, you might introduce me to her. They approached a group of which Miss Moncrief was the center. Reared in the old tradition, she curtsied low before Benjamin. Yes, he might have a dance. He thanked her and walked away, staggered away. The interval until the time for his turn should arrive dragged itself out interminably. He stood close to the wall, silent, inscrutable, watching with murderous eyes the young bloods of Baltimore as they eddied around Hildegard Moncrief, passionate admiration on their faces. How obnoxious they seemed to Benjamin, how intolerably rosy. Their curly brown whiskers aroused in him a feeling equivalent to indigestion. But when his own time came and he drifted with her out upon the changing floor to the music of the latest waltz from Paris, his jealousies and anxieties melted from him like a mantle of snow. Blind with enchantment, he felt that life was just beginning. You and your brother got here just as we did, didn't you? Asked Hildegard, looking up at him with eyes that were like bright blue enamel. Benjamin hesitated. If she took him for his father's brother, would it be best to enlighten her? He remembered his experience at Yale, so he decided against it. It would be rude to contradict a lady. It would be criminal to mar this exquisite occasion with the grotesque story of his origin. Later, perhaps. So he nodded, smiled, listened, was happy. I like men of your age, Hildegard told him. Young boys are so idiotic. They tell me how much champagne they drink at college and how much money they lose playing cards. Men of your age know how to appreciate women. Benjamin felt himself on the verge of a proposal. With an effort, he choked back the impulse. You're just the romantic age, she continued. 50. 25 is too worldly, wise. 30 is apt to be pale from overwork. 40 is the age of long stories that take a whole cigar to tell. 60 is too near 70, but 50 is the mellow age. I love 50. 50 seemed to Benjamin a glorious age. He longed passionately to be 50. I've always said, went on Hildegard, that I'd rather marry a man of 50 and be taken care of than marry a man of 30 and take care of him. For Benjamin, the rest of the evening was bathed in a honey-colored mist. Hildegard gave him 2 more dances and they discovered that they were marvelously in accord on all the questions of the day. She was to go driving with him on the following Sunday, and then they would discuss all of these questions further. Going home in the phaeton just before the crack of dawn, when the first bees were humming and the fading moon glimmered in the cold dew, Benjamin knew vaguely that his father was discussing wholesale hardware. And what do you think should merit our biggest attention after hammers and nails? The elder Button was saying. Love, replied Benjamin absent-mindedly. Lugs? Exclaimed Roger Button. Why, I've just covered the question of lugs. Benjamin regarded him with dazed eyes just as the eastern sky was suddenly cracked with light and an oriole yawned piercingly in the quickening trees. I share this part because I thought it was cute and funny, but also to me it felt as if it hit its stride in terms of the writing itself. I felt like I was paying attention mostly to the writing versus especially that last line. He was being beautiful and literary, and I was like, oh, okay. And I think part of my problem in picking a lot of these books or stories that I've read, knowing that they're based on movies, is I'm comparing them. So here I was obviously consumed by how you would tell this plot. I just remember the movie itself being long and drawn out and sad, very sad and whimsical too. You're like, this could never happen. So I think you went to the theater because it was this could never happen, and because you're Brad Pitt's so hot, even old.
Even old.
Yeah, especially young, but even old. And with this, I was just kind of because to me, this story seems like a concept story when on its face, what you remember of it is that he ages in reverse, right? That's the concept. That's all you really remember. You don't really remember what the literary underpinnings are. And in this sense, it's the idea that he never has a place. He's always behind, too far behind or too far ahead, and I don't know what it's getting at in terms of a larger theme or takeaway. But I cried when I read it, and I'm sure I would have cried in the film too. Like I said, it's been too long to see it, but they achieved something here other than the concept of wouldn't it be interesting if you were born old and died young? And I think it was kind of this feeling that he was always missing out on something. It was really sad. Like I said, I don't know what the larger theme is, except I really truly identified with this character versus not identified, but I empathized with him throughout. I was like, this sucks. God, this sucks. This sucks. And especially when it occurs to him, it's pretty late in the story. He has that scene where he's talking about how he thought at some point this trick that had been happening throughout his life was going to even out. And at some point when he was actually 30 and had been alive for 30 years, then it would stop. It would freeze. And then he kind of realizes this isn't going to stop. And it becomes increasingly sad that first of all, he's born as this old man with all all this experience and knowledge of the world, and like all he wants to do is like to be treated as his age, right? He's capable of more than they're giving him credit for at first. He's like, please, I'd like to eat solid food and talk to adults, you know, and they're having trouble doing that for him. Then they finally kind of give in. But it's almost sadder when he's younger and he goes to enlist in the army again, but like physically his voice cracks when he's trying to say that like I am a man, I'm a 70-year-old, like I'm an experienced veteran, you know. That is when it got so sad. And when he finally realized that like this wasn't going to stop, he was going to die when he was a baby. It was so sad. And then especially the part where it's like all the other kids went on to first grade and he stayed in kindergarten. And then like pretty soon like the only joys in life were like physical touch, because that was the only thing that registered. Like at that age you don't have memories or anything. It was sad. Do you remember watching the movie? Did you see it?
Oh, I never saw the movie, no.
Okay. So what did you think of the story?
So a while ago, I was thinking about, I was like, F. Scott Fitzgerald is this American writer that huge in the pantheon of writers. I should bring a F. Scott Fitzgerald story to the podcast. But I kept looking at it, like every anthology has a different one. And
Yeah.
every list I consulted, like nobody can agree on if he has like a good story, like the best story of his.
Standout one.
Yeah. And I read a few and I was like, I don't know if I really like this one or this one or this one. Then I just was like, I'll find something else. I'll come back to it. So when I saw that you had sent this one over, I was like, okay, there we go. There's a F. Scott Fitzgerald. Somebody else made the decision for me. But I gotta say, I didn't like this one.
Compared to like his other work or like just in
No,
general.
compared to just stories.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You're exactly right. There is some really deep poignancy developed in
Yeah.
this, especially at the end.
Yes.
But overall, I didn't think this was that great of a story.
No,
I
I
didn't
think it
I
was a
didn't
concept.
believe. Yes, exactly. Yes. I call it monological. It's one idea and it doesn't
Okay.
doesn't have any more ideas. But besides that, like I didn't believe a lot of the characters' action, like other characters'
Oh,
actions. I
yeah,
didn't believe
for sure.
what was how people were reacting and
It's like every fairy tale, right? Like we're not supposed to believe that Cinderella has a ball and a gown and
no,
mice.
no,
Yeah.
it's not like that. It's not like it's magical, and I don't believe that he's aging in reverse. It's that characters, I don't believe these are people. They don't seem to be behaving the way people should behave. Like, if you were confronted by this, you would not act in that way. Like, when the character says something, I'm like, what?
Right. I totally agree with that. I don't think it's a fault of his inability to create characters, though. I think it's more what you comfortably slip into with a genre that feels like fairy tale.
There's also a tone problem. Like some of it seems to be meant to be comic, and I the first like many pages of it, I was like, what tone? Like, what is he trying to do with the
Yeah.
tone of this thing? I'm not quite sure where to land with it. Am I supposed to be laughing at these things? Like all these characters are so angry, but they're being funny. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I get like going with the Cinderella reference, like her step family is horrific to her, and you're like, would people really be this horrific? Just kind of like how in this, like his dad is horrible to him, his son is horrible to him.
Yeah, it's not just the horribleness though. To me, it's like the his dad is like denying reality.
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah, I guess I still think it's like because we know that F. Scott Fitzgerald, I mean, can do other things better than this.
Oh yeah,
I think it's just like a fault of like the fact that it's a premise that he just, yeah, you know, he didn't really spend a lot of time with these other folks, you know, he just he probably whipped
that's
through
right.
this.
I feel like he had one idea and
Yeah,
he traced it out and he thought he'd add some fun stuff along the way, which,
yeah,
some of it was, there was like moments that were great, but overall, I didn't think it had except like what you pointed out, that just that developing poignancy of what he's missing out on. And then the ending part was like affecting in a lot of ways.
yeah.
But throughout the beginning of it and through the middle, I was just struggling with it.
Right. I didn't read criticism on this because I kind of read it as like a throwaway story in terms of like
Yeah, I didn't
drawing
either.
much out of it. But the only thing I can think is like there were other themes throughout with the wife in particular that make me think that maybe this is one good thing to draw on. But with the wife, I felt a certain poignancy toward her too because she was at one point the young prize and then the roles were reversed and he cast her away. And it was horrific.
Yeah.
And like she sounded like she was a bump on the log by the end, but like they didn't get to age together. So she was like this young, pretty prize when he looked like a 50-year-old. And then when she's 50 and he's 30, he's like, God, she's so boring. She's so ugly. I can have any girl I want. I'm not going to divorce her though. I'm just going to like go party with these other women. I'm like, Benjamin, you're a
Go to
tool.
college.
Yeah, I was like, Benjamin, you got it coming, FYI. So that was terrible. And then I'm thinking, like, if you were gonna maybe expand on that theme, then you could think about how horrible we are to old people, which this story did, and how tender we are with babies. Like kids have we all view them as innocent. And in this story, this is the opposite of an innocent child. By the end, things like his memory were removed, so you could kind of argue he wasn't really a 70-year-old at that point. But he was a young child that had done horrific things during his entire life, and he was still being comforted and coddled in a lot of ways. But like as an old man, where he's like, please respect me. I want to wear a suit. Like I don't want to wear a onesie. They're like, you don't know what's good for you. Like if there's anything that's like true outside of this ridiculous premise, it could be those things. The way we treat women and how they age, the way we coddle all children as innocent and perfect, even though I've met some horrific children, and the way we cast aside old people because they are, on a whole, very annoying. The only person that deserves it are the aged. Just kidding. That's really like big thing I can draw on. But otherwise, I was just like I said, kind of like I cried. I was like surprised that I cried. It doesn't take much these days, but
I want to give an example of what I was talking about with like, this is a moment when I wrote in the margin, I said, what is this story? But
yeah.
just the idea that people behave in such bizarre ways and the tone just seems so weird. So he's in the hospital. His baby has just been born, which, by the way, this baby doesn't have a mother. It's just the father.
Oh, I wrote that on the margin right away. I was like, if anything should be horrified, it's the mother that just gave birth to a full
I know.
size fucking human.
She never shows up. She's not in the
Yeah, maybe
story.
it's because she died in childbirth.
She must have. And nobody mourns her. She doesn't exist. Anyway, so he's thinking about the future. A grotesque picture formed itself with dreadful clarity before the eyes of the tortured man. A picture of himself walking
Yeah.
through the crowded streets of the city with this appalling apparition stalking by its side. He's thinking of what he thinks of as a baby, but he's a 70-year-old man. I can't, he moaned. People would stop to speak to him, and what was he going to say? He would have to introduce this septuagenarian. This is my son, born early this morning. And then the old man would gather his blanket around him and they would plod on past the bustling stores, the slave market. For a dark instant, Mr. Button wished passionately that his son was black. Past the luxurious houses of the residential district, past the home for the aged. He wanted to sell his this old man?
Yeah, dude, I read that.
Come, pull yourself together, commanded the nurse. See here, the old man announced suddenly. If you think I'm going to walk home in this blanket, you're entirely mistaken. Babies always have blankets. What? Babies always have blankets. He acknowledges that it's an old man, it's a septuagenarian, but he
Yes.
refuses to acknowledge that this not a baby might require something more than baby things. I was
Yeah.
like, when Gregor Samsa turned into a giant bug, his family reacted to him as if he was a giant bug, not as if he was Gregor Samsa. Anyway.
I have no excuse for any of this other than like I feel like I ignored like the first two sections.
Oh yeah.
I was so bored by this whole intro. I was like, how much time are we going to spend on the birth? Because I knew that the story was so short and we spent so much time like marveling at the fact that he was born old. And I was like, this isn't even the crux of the story. Like, let's get into it. I think this just goes to prove like F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote this in a weekend and
Yeah.
he's like, this is good enough. Like, I don't think there's like a whole lot of thought or editing because, yeah, they spent way too much time. And then, like, even like the scenes walking through the streets, it's like, I'm bored by this. I want to see like what he does with his life. And that's also part of why I read the section I did because it felt like the first part where he was going to have agency. Like he liked that woman and wanted to be with that woman. And he ended up getting to do exactly that. Whereas he was rejected from Yale because he was weird and old. He just went to work for his dad because he had to. Like, this is the point in his timeline of life where he hit his stride. It's probably the equivalent of like reading a story about a little kid and until they're 18, they can't like really do anything. And that's really when the pace picks up, So here it was like, all right, he's coming of age at 50. He's going to like take this story by the reins. It was more interesting.
Yeah, and I think he literally does because that beginning part, it's mostly through his father's point of view. It's like,
yes,
the father's outside the hospital and the doctor's like, I'm leaving. How could you do this to me? And we meet the baby through the father's point of view.
We spent a lot of time on the hospital's reputation.
That's right.
I was like, this argument doesn't make sense.
No. So it's told in his point of view, the father's point of view. It's not told in Benjamin's point of view until
Right.
later. But yeah, and so that section where he's interested in her.
Yeah.
I think after that point, you're right. It's a better story for him. Like his journey
Right.
is more interesting at that point. But I was questioning this where she's like, I like men your age. It's like, who is this girl? Who are you writing, F. Scott Fitzgerald? Who are you writing for?
Yeah. Yeah. It was a weird thing. Yeah. And you also kind of wanted to tell her, like, it only gets worse from here, sweetie. You know?
Yeah, start when they're 50. No, no.
But yeah, I don't know. I felt like the story was just like trying to figure out what it was for that whole first section. If I was going to criticize, I'd be like, cut all this, blah, blah, blah. Because I didn't care so much about the father as I did like Benjamin.
Yes.
The father acts like the worst thing in the world is to have a son that's old, when really the worst thing in the world is to age reverse.
Yeah, there could be something said about fatherhood.
Yeah.
You'd have to introduce the mother somehow, but
Oh, I know that's terrible. But like as soon as like Benjamin's like marries this girl, like they don't even like talk about the dad anymore. Then like it becomes about like his son, who's like, you can live with me, but you got to call me uncle. Like yeah. To your point about like these aren't real characters. I don't buy that the predominant reaction to Benjamin would be that you're embarrassed by him. Like
yeah,
nobody at any point in 70 years empathizes with this guy or is like marveling at the situation. They're just kind of like, this is weird, and I don't want to explain it to anyone. Like what proper society. However, I will mention that I briefly considered that I wish I'd be able to sell him on the slave trade. Like, God, they're happy with like thinking horrible thoughts, but not having an old son. I don't have a whole lot to say about it, I guess, except that like I was touched by some of it. And like, I don't think that this is an argument against stories that are like purely conceptual on the outset. If you have an idea for something like really fun and you want to write it, I think you should write it. But I think if you want it to be publishable or something that people remember for more than the premise, then it has to have an actual story to it that is, relatable in some way and like has a message or a point. But like I said, the only other thing that I kind of think of that this reminded me of was another movie based one. And I think that has a lot to do with Hollywood. Hollywood picks conceptual stories
yes.
because they'll add the shit to it and then they'll be able to say they'll make it theirs, but like they don't care about how it ends or anything. But the only other story this one in particular reminded me of was the Walter Mitty one because I think it was a concept and I think it was brief. But I think the way that writer got away with it is how short it was. It ended before. I mean, this guy took too long to do this thing. It could have been much shorter and still probably made me cry. And then I wouldn't have treated it like a short story gone wrong. I would have been like, this is a cute conceptual thing that managed to make me cry. I guess I think it's just like kind of similar where I didn't have a great expectation from the Walter Mitty story when I realized what it was. But here it's like I invested a little bit more time. And so it is a little bit more kind of disappointing that there wasn't more to it.
I don't know that I would have finished this if I didn't have
Yeah,
to.
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
like, I wouldn't have gotten to that poignancy at the end unless we were
Yes.
recording this episode.
There's even no hint that there's going to be a turn in terms of like it hitting its stride in the middle there. We didn't
Yeah.
get the sense that there's like impending agency about to happen.
So I would think that, to quote unquote fix the story, I would make the
Mhm.
characters more realistic, have them respond to what there was actually happening in front of them rather than be cutouts for some kind of theme.
Right.
The confusion about him it makes sense. There should be confusion about him, but the confusion can manifest more realistically. It can, like when he's supposed to be a baby, but he's a 70-year-old man. That is a crazy thing. But when you walk in the room, you don't try to put a diaper on him, which they didn't do, but
Yeah.
equivalent. You treat him as like, okay, I don't know what's happening here, but I guess we'll get you some pants.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he could have done things to make a little more believable.
Yeah, you just make the other characters believable, the characters and the way in which they interact with him believable. Then you can reach for more. It doesn't have to just be the one thing.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of sounds like your takeaway. Like the only other thing I like kind of learned from this is something I've said before, which is like if you do have a concept, like I think you should write it. I'm glad F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote this. It's an interesting thing to think about, whether or not he explored all the possibilities of what this might entail. Like it got picked up for a movie because there's something interesting here. It's interesting to think about, like what would happen if you had to age in reverse? Like what are the merits of aging the way we age? Like this is interesting. So if he wanted to write it, I'm glad he wrote it.
The way we treat age too, the ageism and the
Yeah.
various guises within society is a really fertile grounds for exploring as a theme.
Yeah. So the only other thing I would say is just kind of like if you have a concept story and you know that, which you might not know that, but if when you are able to describe your story to someone, it's like a what if story, you know? What if
Yeah.
you age in reverse? You know, if it's one of those, maybe that's a good way to recognize it. Or even if you know that like the story's going to kind of run its course, layer in something meaningful, and then you probably have something really good. Like there's no concept story that I want to read. There's concept movies that I will go watch for sure. Because what do those have? Sex, drugs, loud explosions. They're visually impactful. If you have like a headlining actress or actor, I'll go for that. Like Benjamin Button, who knows if it would have gotten off the ground without Brad fucking Pitt.
Yeah, I'm curious about the movie now. What did they add to it?
You gotta go see it.
Because that's basically my takeaway is you can't write a story with one idea. You got to have more than one idea, even if they're small ideas that you kind of like plop on the edges of it, kind of like Niggle, where he adds all the paintings around the big painting. You have to put more ideas in there. You can weave two together. Just like he has one idea here, he doesn't have an idea for any of the other characters. So I'm thinking about the movie. It's like, did they do something else with it? Did they change it, make it more realistic? Did they like what did they do to the movie to make it a movie and make it better? I'm curious. I never saw it.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think like you can add something and it doesn't have to be like that it was your brilliant concept to write about ageism through the lens of a man that ages backwards. It could be okay that like your concept was a story about a man that ages backwards. Oh, wait, I'm going to add this because it kind of is poignant. You know, like that's not cheating or anything. You don't have to like have thought about this perfect melding of concept and theme.
I think if you treat characters as real people, that will come across. That will just happen spontaneously because you've come up with this idea of aging backwards and like, how do real people interact with a character who has, for example, the mentality of a 5-year-old, but the body of a 65-year-old? Like that's going to be, it's going to say something about the way people treat people because he's going to react as a 5-year-old, but they're going to treat him as a 65-year-old. And as long as they treat him realistically that way, we can see the distinction, the disjunction in like what he's thinking about, how he sees them and understands them and how they treat him and understand him because of his outward appearance. That'll just come out.
Yeah.
I think it could. And then, you know, once you notice it in your writing, you go back and you kind of like, all right, let me tweak it a little bit.
Yeah. We've talked about this like in different concepts where I always talk about like, go ahead and layer in like the meaning later. I do that all the time. And people are like, oh, I love how you did this. I'm like, yeah, me too.
The theme of our podcast is do something with your theme.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.